All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Two Guys and a Bible, the other two guys in the Bible. This is William Bell, and with me is Larry Siegle, a face and a voice that you recognize. It is a pleasure to be with him. Don Preston is, I believe he's out of state, and I'm not sure, what business he's on at this point, but he was unable to make it tonight. So he asked me and Larry to join together and do the program tonight on Two Guys in the Bible. Larry, why don't you tell us a little bit about what's going on with you? How are you doing, and what's happening?
Well, we just celebrated 1 year this month of coming from Honolulu, where we had been living for 6 years,
Mhm.
out here to Warren, Ohio, in our haunts of the past, you and I. And there's a congregation here, the Cortland Church of Christ. Terry Seivert and Jeannie had been working here for the last 26 years or so, and he's in his 70s. He wanted to relax and retire a little bit, so called up and he's like, "Can you come out and help?" And so here we are. And so that's what we're doing. It's a nice place to be. It gets a little colder in the wintertime than Honolulu did, but we're coping with that. I realized something about us, you and me, earlier. You and I met 35 years ago. 35 years has gone by.
Wow.
Do you remember three of us showing up at your door in the middle of the night
I
and knocking
do,
on
I
the
do. Why
door?
don't why don't you tell them about that? Because this that's an interesting story.
Well, we were going to the same school you had graduated from. What year did you graduate, by the way?
I graduated in 1981. I started in 79 and graduated in 1981.
1891. Oh, in 1981. Sorry.
1981.
You're not that old yet. Um, well, this was 1989, and the summertime had gone to Memphis, and they were having the various classes. They had classes on the parables of Jesus during the summer time, and then the first semester there, the first quarter, they did the book of Matthew. And so there were several of us in class that started pondering the passages there, and we began to put things together. And we had some background. We had Foy Wallace's stuff and Franklin Camp and so on, but we wanted to know more about this thing, and we got accused. Or our brother Cates, are you guys teaching that Max Kingism? Well, we'd not really ever heard of Max Kingism, and so being the investigative kind of people that we are, we called and found Ed Stevens. We found Max and called out here to Warren, and I spoke to C.D. Beagle. He answered the phone over there, and I got to talk to him a little bit. What a man he was! I never met him in person. Did you meet
Yeah,
CD?
yeah, I did meet him because he was on a couple of the first lectures that I participated in.
His mind was sharp as a trap. I mean, he was just amazing. And talking to him on the phone those times. But anyway, he began to tell me about this guy in Memphis that had a congregation over there. His name was William Bell. And so the three of us that were going to school at the time, we said, you know what, we need to go visit William. So we got out our trench coats in the middle of the night, and we piled into the car, and we had called you and to tell you we wanted to come see you, but we drove over to your house. We got out of the car carefully in the middle of the night, not knowing what to expect. I mean, you know how they talked about you guys at the school. We thought,
Oh yeah,
what if this
yeah.
guy has horns and a tail? And so we came over and knocked on the door, and you answered. And of course, being the tall person that you are compared to my shortness, I'm looking up. And but you were as nice as anyone I'd ever met. You were helpful. You gave us a boatload of stuff there to take with us, and really helped us along. We appreciated that very much.
Yeah, well, that was interesting. What I recall from that meeting after we talked, and I think the next time we had a conversation, you were telling me about you and the guys that came along with you, that you all were after that meeting, you were going back and forth saying, "Tell me this is not true. Tell me that." Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. We would go over to the library there, which was in the lower area of the back building, which of course
Right.
they're not there anymore. They're out in Germantown now.
Mhm.
But we would go over there and study at night. There were three or four of us, and we just were pacing because we were reading this stuff, and this can't be true. And Rick, the other person that was there, and by the way, he teaches this completely where he's at now. And but
Sorry. I thought my phone was off.
not a
Um,
problem. I did that one time, not a couple of weeks ago.
okay, go ahead. I'm listening.
But anyway, we he threw the book all the way across the room. Said, "This can't be true. This can't be true." We were just, we didn't. It's like anyone else. When you come to the facts of what fulfillment really means, you have a decision to make. And none of us wanted to believe this because we saw all of our future hopes and dreams and preaching. We just barely made it through the school. They wanted to get rid of us right away. I'm not sure how you made it through the school with the.
Oh man, that is a story within itself. That that is a story. I'll share it when you're done.
Okay.
Uh,
Okay, but yeah, it was difficult from that time on. Where we ordered books from, or we came to a place where we said, "Look, we're going to have to set this aside until we graduate because we don't have time to do the studies and the classes and the memory work and all that stuff, and be able to study this at the same time." So we all agreed that we would lay this aside until we graduated, and then we would begin to study and take a closer look at it. And the time went by. I went to South Carolina. Rick went to Mississippi, and we wrote an article for the Living Presence back in that cost both of us our preaching work. Apparently, just writing an article for a magazine will get you in trouble, and so that's kind of the way it was. And then when Jack Scott moved from Memphis out to Warren here, I went from South Carolina out to California. So that's sort of the trek that took place in those days.
yeah, well, asking about how I survived those days in school, it was quite a ride. I think to begin with, after a while, there were, I want to say, by the time we graduated, there were only 9 students left in our class. I don't know how many started, but we had a lot of dropouts, guys who started and they didn't make it. You probably had some of the same in yours. But at any rate, as I was going through, the same thing happened where, I remember Brother Frank Young, who was
Right.
Gus Nichols' son-in-law, by the way,
Yeah.
and Gus Nichols debated Max King. But anyway, I remember hearing him when we were in the book of Matthew. He would, when he got to Matthew chapter 3 and start talking about John the Baptist, he said, "Well, Max King, he believes this refers to 70 AD." He said, "Can you believe that, brethren?" And so I was sitting there, and as he said it, I'm saying, "Who is Max King?"
Right.
And I said, "Well, that's the same thing that I believe." I didn't say it out loud, but I was saying it to myself. But it certainly raised a lot of curiosity as to this name, Max King. And then several of those of us who were students, occasionally, we did these mock debates with each other, et cetera. And
Right.
there was this guy, he was from Tennessee. I don't even call his name, but anyway, he was supposed to be the top debater in class and everything. And so we would get into these discussions, and he would say the same thing. This is Max King's doctrine. So finally, this student came on about a quarter after I did, and we became sort of buddies. Where we studied together a lot. He was a pretty sharp guy, and we studied a lot. And once he found out, it was like he was going to sabotage me. Well, he did
Yeah.
attempt to do that. So he went down and talked to the director, who was Hearn at the time, R.J. Hearn. So Brother Hearn, and so he went down. He said, "Do you know there's a brother among us who believes that Christ has already come? He believes the Max King doctrine." And so shortly thereafter, Brother Hearn called me down to the office to have a talk with me. And so we had a conversation about it. And, you already mentioned 2 names, and that was Foy Wallace Jr. and Franklin Kemp.
Yeah.
Well, uh, I knew that Brother Hearn was a very good friend of both of them, particularly, of Fort Wallace Jr., even though they, for the most part, those brothers didn't like his commentary on the book of Revelation, which took a preterist point of view, a 370 AD date for the writing of Revelation. And the, he also agreed with Franklin Camp, who took a uh, uh, view on the book, excuse me, on the Holy Spirit, that
Right.
the Holy Spirit's work was completed in 70 AD. So I knew both of those going into the meeting with him. And so when I went into the meeting, I said, well, Brother Hearn, I said, you and I already believe a lot of passages refer to 70 AD. And he couldn't say very much about that. And so the outcome of that conversation was, he said, well, just kind of keep that under your hat. Don't say a whole lot about it. And but he never threatened me with being put out of school at that particular point. And
Yeah.
then, we had, I guess, what they call the uh, what's that meeting that we have? What was the name of that meeting? When you come and they put you on the hot seat, so to speak. Do you remember?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know what you would call that, but it was a,
Well, I know Ed Stevens had a name for it because they apparently did it at the Sunset School of Preaching where he was
yeah,
also,
true.
because he gave me the name. At least he mentioned it by name. But it's where they bring you down and you got all the faculty members that they interrogate. So at that point, we were talking, and I don't know if we got into the eschatology thing at that point, but they said something about me not continuing in the school. And I just told him, I said, well, when I can't study, I said, you can send me home anyway. I said, I didn't come here to, basically mimic what somebody else believes. I came here to learn, what the scriptures teach. And if I can't do that, then, you might as well send me home. So a little bit after that, we got into a conversation, and Brother Hearn basically told me, he said, keep this under your hat, don't make a big stir of it. And that's what I did. I didn't, even though I debated back and forth with some of the students, first and second year students, I never made an issue of it. Well, after I finished school, so I guess in that way, they allowed me to graduate. Um, After I graduated, that's when the issue happened. I went back over to the school. I had written this little book on eschatology and Galatians, which we did at the seminar, in Warren,
Yeah.
Ohio. So I went back to the school and I was going to just give them a copy of the book, because they had books from just about everybody there. Well, I go in this day, and here is Curtis Cates now, who was the director at the time you were there. He was
Right.
the director of the school. And so as I walk in to the library, um, he comes in and he said, you believe that AD 70 doctrine? He said, I can refute that in 30 seconds or 5 minutes or whatever he said. Well, he started off in the conversation on Daniel chapter 2.
Right.
And before long, it turned out to be a lot longer than, 30 seconds or even a couple of minutes. And by that time, the whole student body had gathered in the library, which was adjacent to the secretary's office.
Right.
And then after it kind of got a little bit too hot for him, because I was answering everything that he was basically saying, and he said, well, let's go into one of the studios, the little study rooms. I
Yeah.
said, no, 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 no. I said, we started it out here. Let's finish it out here. By that time, I was aware that we had an audience. So I wanted them to hear everything that was going on. Well, apparently he had been telling them that he could refute it, just like that it was
Yeah.
nothing, he could refute it. And so they called me into this office, and there was, who else was there? There was Garland Elkins. And
Okay.
what was the other dean? What was his name? He was like a dean of students or
Keith,
something. Or
was it Keith Mosier
no,
or
not Keith Mosher.
Brother
That was
Curry? I'm not
no,
sure.
no, no, no.
Brother
Billy
Billy Bland.
Billy Bland. Yeah, it was Billy Bland. And so he was in there, and we started going round and round, and then it got a little bit heated. Brother Woods, not Woods, brother Cates, who was a short man, okay, and a thin man on top of it.
Very, very true.
But he got so heated in the discussion that he started to point his finger at me and shout at me and basically tell me what I was going to do and what he was going to do. And I said, hold it right here. So I stood up and I started looking down on his head like that. And I think it kind of scared Garland Elkins a little bit. He said, hold it now. He said, let's kind of calm down. I said,
Yeah.
well, you need to get him because he's about to get into some trouble. And so finally, he said, we're going to calm down a little bit and we're going to go round and round and ask questions back and forth. We're going to do this real orderly. So we did. And so we went, and I think we stayed in that room a couple of hours, all the way till
Right.
lunchtime. And I got there that morning. Well, um, when we got to some text in Daniel, I had been listening to Garland Elkins on the radio. So I
Right.
knew his position on the book of Revelation as well, and on some things in Daniel. And I actually used his arguments against Kate's in the discussion. And Garland Elkins was agreeing with what I was saying on those
Right.
particular arguments. Now, he didn't agree. I want to make this clear because, somebody may think I'm saying something incorrect about him. And I know he's passed on, but he didn't agree with the AD 70 position. But the
No.
arguments that were being made from Daniel, he did agree with, and those arguments supported, the view that I held. So by the end of that conversation, he said, uh, "Did you graduate?" He said, "How did you get a diploma from here?" He said, "Brother Hearn didn't know about this." I said, "Oh yes, he knew," and I just related to you the incidents that we had with
Right.
him with the discussions, and I said, "Yes, he knew." And he said, "Well, we're going to see if we can take your diploma."
I see.
So he was going to try to take it. And I said, well, wait a minute. I said, why would you have a problem with me graduating from this school, having a different view on this particular doctrine? And many of you went to other schools from denominational schools and got your degrees, your higher degrees.
Right.
I said, so what's the difference? And I said, if you go in the library, you got books from just about everybody out there that's written a book, in the religious world, as far as commentaries, etc. So you study from them. So what's wrong with having another different one? I said, I know you don't agree with every book that you have on that shelf, and you don't agree with the major doctrines of the people where you studied at these higher universities. And so from that point, they didn't say anything. We went on, and that was pretty much it. But later on, students from the school contacted me. A couple of them came by my house,
Right.
and they told me, they said, we couldn't believe it. They said, after you left, all of us were sitting up in that room quiet. They said, you could have heard a pin drop in that
Yeah.
room. Nobody said a word. And they said, everybody was thinking, he told us he could refute this just like that.
Yeah.
And that wasn't the story. As a matter of fact, a couple of guys in that room actually became preterists. They were secret preterists for the most part, but they
Right.
did as a result. But anyway,
You,
that's kind of the story.
Brother Cates taught the book of Revelation, and he used Homer Haley's commentary, which is 476. It's all about Rome.
Uh-huh.
But what was interesting is that when they were talking about the dating of the book of Revelation, we pulled out our Foy Wallace commentary on the book of Revelation. We began to give the arguments there. And Brother Cates was like, now, Brother Wallace was up in years and a little bit senile when he wrote that book on Revelation. And I said, didn't he write the book on the versions after he wrote the commentary on Revelation? And, it's just those kinds of, by the way, Garland Elkins was our debate class teacher.
Okay. Okay.
And I don't know how you all did this when you were in.
See, we didn't have a debate class when I was there. That came along afterwards.
Well, they put all of the stuff in a hat of the various doctrines and so on that they wanted to have pro and against, for and against debates. I reached into that hat and I pulled out to defend the AD 70 doctrine.
Of all things.
Of all things, out of all the chances, I had to get that. Those were great years, and it was a blessing when we had the opportunity to meet you in person, and having known you all these years, I certainly admire your ministry and all that God has done through you, your travels to various parts of the world and all those things. What a blessing.
Well, it's certainly the same thing here, and I'm really delighted that you got an opportunity to go back and work with Terry Seibert um, at the Cortland Church. I know that when we were working with Matt, or shortly thereafter, with Max, shortly thereafter, they started that congregation, and it has gone on for all these years with Terry and Jeannie, and that's just awesome. That's wonderful. So I want to congratulate you on that work and hope that everything continues to go well for you.
Most of the older members in the congregation remember us from back in the days when we came out for the Covenant Eschatology
Mm-hmm.
Seminar.
Mm-hmm.
And they know you, they know Don, they know me, and they still would like to see you guys again. So
Oh, wow.
that's pretty amazing, right?
Yeah, yeah, it is. It is. Well, okay, Larry. Good stories. Good to go back and talk about those war stories that happened, very early on in our careers in ministry, and to see us still going here after so many years, and to see all who have come along afterward. It's just amazing. I actually got a call this week and had a conversation with a young man from New York, by the way,
Wow.
who is he's a preterist. He had just a few questions, but we had a long, very good conversation. And he's 22 years of age. I was about that age when I started.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you look at the generations that have come along afterwards, and you see how it spread across the world, really, and is continuing to spread. And I'm sure as you look, from your social media outlets that you're using, as well as everything else that we're doing, people are continually coming on. I've had some new people on Facebook. They're just coming and listening to the information, and things are continuing to grow. So that's very good.
There are people here in the community that, I go to the gym twice a week. You couldn't tell by looking at me, but I go to the gym twice a week. And, we talk about things. You reach out to people, you care about them, that kind of thing. They ask
Mhm.
questions. They want to know who you are and where you're from and those kinds of things. And we're making some progress in the community. A lot of good people out here, really are.
Good, very good, very good. Well, I try to exercise and I don't, go to the gym. I got a membership, and I need to go back. I go for a while, and then the routine just gets to me, and I have to stop. But I maintain a health regimen, constantly. Exercise this morning, did some weightlifting and
That's
all that stuff, just to try to stay in shape enough to do what we have to do. Sometimes doing this work is very mentally and physically
it is.
exhausting. But
Somebody asked me the other day if I could run. I said, depends on who's chasing me.
there you go. That's it. All right. So we said that we would talk a little bit about 1 Corinthians 15 and the resurrection.
Okay.
Um, that's a subject, as you know, that has been and still is hotly debated. And we still have quite an emphasis on the resurrection being a physical resurrection. So, and people get into the discussions over whether it is corporate, whether it is, individual body,
Right.
and whether it's physical, all of those things. And so, and I know you did not too long ago on this program, if I'm not mistaken, you did some studies on 1 Corinthians 15. Am I correct?
I did that with Spencer
Yeah.
from a
Okay.
guy named Spencer down there. He lives in Kentucky and so on, and
Okay.
very knowledgeable. And we talked about 1 Corinthians 15. We went down through the Greek and looked at the verbs in the text there. And I began to see those when I was in school. We'd be going through there and I'd have a Greek New Testament. And I'm like, how can this be the third person plural, present, active, indicative? How's that possible? And still refer to something that is future. It didn't
Mm-hmm.
make sense to me then, and it still doesn't make sense to me now because the verbs don't agree. Now, when Paul's talking about Christ and his resurrection, guess what? He uses a past tense verb.
Mm-hmm.
That that's the way it should be. But when he's talking about Christians and those who were during the first century there, he uses the present tense to show that the process of resurrection had been launched and was underway in terms of the remnant and so on.
Yeah. So when you talk about the present active indicative, that's saying that
I'm
this
sorry, present passive
passive.
indicative.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Um, when you speak of that, it's demonstrating that this was an action that was ongoing at the time. I recall back during the days that I was attending the School of Preaching, by the way, and I might have graduated, I can't remember, but I sat down and went through every single verse, looking up every word in the verse. I actually had a little pack that I put together, compiled with all of the verbs of 1 Corinthians 15, and I even, if I'm not if I can't, if I can recall, I brought it here to where I am now. But I can't find it. I wish I still had it, because I use it often to refer to it. But that made a tremendous impact on the study of the chapter, and it still does. And it's amazing that so many people do not pay attention to that. They just read the text. And let me just throw out one passage that speaks about that. And you talked about that present passive or middle, 1 Corinthians 15, 42 and 43. So tell us how you would see those verses based on the use of that.
Well, and not only that, but let me just say one thing about your teaching. You did a teaching a while back on verse 49 about having borne the image of the man of dust, we should also bear the image of the man of heaven. And that just brings out a point there of the fact that he was saying not shall be as in yet future, a long time from now, but at that time they should bear the image of the man from heaven. And so that speaks a lot of hope. If you don't have that message of Williams, find it. It's worth listening to. It's a great message. But when I looked at the verbs there, one of the things that really stuck out at me, William, in studying this is where it talks about Christ having risen from the dead. The word is out from among the dead ones.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't that he was raised, it wasn't just his physical resurrection, but where he had been that was under consideration. He was raised out from the Hadean realm. And that was a key element. And also, anytime you look at Romans 1:4, you look at Philippians there with Paul, it's out from among the dead ones. Talking about where Jesus had been when he died. He went into the death and Hades and went into that realm, and he came out from there. And that's the point. Not just Jesus was not the first one to be raised physically. The Old Testament is full of that. The ministry of Jesus, Eutychus fell out the window and he got resurrected physically, and Lazarus. But Jesus was the first to come out from among those dead ones, never to die again. He had victory over Hades and death. And that's something none of the rest of them could say, because even if Lazarus had been raised physically, if he lived long enough, he was going to die again, right?
That's great.
So,
yeah, that's an important point. And also in looking at that was the fact that he was raised out of that old covenant realm as well. And you have a text like 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18, that says, he was put to death in the flesh. Those are locatives there.
That's right.
And they deal with the location of where the action took place. And so, and I remember reading a commentary from Guy and Woods, who's another, Church of Christ preacher that's associated with the School of Preaching where we attended. But he made some comments on that text that helped to solidify my understanding of that. But the point is that Christ, as his entire being, was a part of that old covenant system. And when he died, he was delivered from it. So it says he was put to death in the flesh, but he was made alive in the spirit. Now, some translations will have by the Spirit, and that's not accurate,
That's
but
the
it should
instrumental
be,
case. Yeah.
yeah, it should be um, in the locative. And
Right.
so it's the sphere in which he was made alive. So he takes up his role in the realm of the spirit as opposed to the realm of the flesh. And that's one of the things that the saints were being called out of. They were being called out of that old covenant system of the flesh, which is, to me, clearly delineated in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 through 5, and then entering into that realm of the spirit. Now, you talked about 1 Corinthians 15:49.
Yeah.
And I happened to be reading that, and I think that study came as a result of that, that paper that I had mentioned to you before when I went through and did all those translations, and particularly of those verbs. And so I looked at the text, and as I did, further study on it, it says, as we bore the image of the earthly. Well, if I recall correctly, and I haven't looked at it lately, I think
Right.
that's the aorist.
Right.
And if it's aorist, it's talking about something that would have occurred in the past.
Right.
Um, the problem with that is you can't look at it totally as such, because if it were physical, for example, and this would be true on both sides, but if it were talking about the physical body, it would be indicating that the saints had already exited their physical bodies.
Yeah.
And here is Paul writing to them, as we bore, meaning an aorist or a past tense, the image of the earthly. Now, the problem in the text is the translation with the second part of the verse,
Yeah.
where it's translated, we shall also bear, which is future. So what you would have in a case like that, if you took it literally, you would have them having already exited, quote, the physical body, if you're going to interpret the text from that perspective, and they would not have yet entered the spiritual body. So they would be somewhere in between. They would be in that interim state. Now, the problem with there's another problem. The problem with that, and look, this is not something that I'm making up. The
Right.
scholars have recognized this. As a matter of fact, Gordon Fee, in his, I think it's Gordon Fee, is it Fee in the New International Commentary of the New Testament? I think that's him. He discusses this at length in the commentary on 1 Corinthians 15. He
Yeah.
recognizes the problem. And what's interesting is, in that study that I did, I had some studies with Ed Stevens
Yeah.
after our meeting in Kansas in 2011, where both of us did presentation on the resurrection. Ed Stevens recognized the problem, and he brought in a lot more scholars
Yeah.
that recognized the issue, who basically said, well, if this other translation is correct, or at least I think this was Ed's conclusion, he said, if this other translation is correct, which I'll mention in a moment, he said, then that basically destroys this idea of a his position on the IBD, and it certainly
Right.
destroys the physical point of view. But the difference is, in some of our manuscripts, we have um, foresamen and
Hmm.
foresomen.
Yeah.
Okay, the difference is between one letter in the word.
Yeah.
If it's the short O, which is the Omicron, and I want to get this right because I haven't looked at this,
Yeah.
I think that would be the future tense,
Okay.
if I'm not mistaken. And you can check it. It could be the reverse, but this is the essence of what the point is. If it's the omega, then it is the aorist subjunctive.
Right.
And the future tense would put the whole thing future. And that's why you have people who take the futurist view arguing that the resurrection is future, because it says we shall bear the image of the heavenly. We have not yet put that on. And so they want to sort of rest their confidence and their argument on that futurism.
Another good point on that is the fact that the one that they chose to put into the versions is the minority view of the
Exactly.
text. The
Exactly.
majority view says, let us,
Yes.
let us bear the image. And it's present tense there. And Paul is saying, let's do that now.
Yeah. Well, with that aorist subjunctive, here's the impact of it. Because it's aorist, it means that that action had already begun. So they were already putting on that new image, but it was not completed. And the subjunctive is the part that suggests the future of that because it's probable action in the future. And Paul uses those verbs in several places in the New Testament.
He does.
And they're very, very important. As a matter of fact, A.T. Robertson in his big grammar said that the aorist subjunctive was basically the case of the future because it's used in connection with the future tense, but it has that past aspect to it. So when you read Gordon Fee recognizes this. He calls attention to it. He's totally aware of it. So what he does is he says, look, we cannot put this wholly in the future. We have to recognize that in some way they are already participating in resurrection. So here's how he handled it. He said, well, this would be, I think he called it behavioral modifications.
Right.
So he made it to be some aspect of how they're living the Christian life or something of that nature, short of a future resurrection. But he had to get it because he knows, technically speaking, that's what that verb meant. And I remember when I first presented that, it was one of the arguments I presented to Ed when we went to you. You were with us?
I was with you at the Evangelical Theological Society
Yes.
there in
Yeah. What year
2012.
was that?
2012.
12? Okay,
Yeah.
2012. All right.
We were
So
in
yeah,
Minnesota, right?
huh?
When we were in
Minnesota. Yeah, it was in Minnesota. So what was interesting is I asked the question to Ed, and because he had written this paper called the was it the death of Adam or something like that. Anyway, that was his paper, and I went through it fine tooth comb
Yeah.
and responded to it. Um, and so we were having a conversation about it. I hadn't sent him my responses yet, but we were having a conversation. And I remember as we were walking down the aisle, he said, "You really went through that paper." I said, "Oh yeah." I said, "I went through everything that you said in that paper." And so I asked him that question, and I think he suggested. I can't remember exactly what his argument was, but he suggested something that maybe was some point about the Greek. So we had all those Greek scholars there.
Yep.
You know, what's his name? William, uh, the one who wrote what's his name?
Mounts. Was it
Mounts.
Mounts? Yeah.
Yeah, it was Mounts, and a lot of other Greek scholars who were there.
Yeah.
And so I asked them, after Ed said that, I just asked them point blank. I said, could this text be translated this way? They said, absolutely not.
No.
It was kind of funny, but it's a very important text, and people should study that. It has a tremendous impact on the meaning of 1 Corinthians 15. And as you were saying, Larry, um, and Gordon Fee points this out. He said the very fact that only a couple of manuscripts contain the future interpretation or the word that means the future, and the majority of them, something like 4,000 or more, have the uh, aorist subjunctive. He said
Right.
that's proof positive that the two guys that went to sleep during the translation, in essence,
Yeah.
that's what he's saying. I'm kind of kidding. He said it was the two who put the Omicron there, not
Yeah.
the 4,000 who were doing it. He said that answers the argument within itself. And but he handled it very scholarly, and I thought he did a great job of pointing out what the issue was. I just thought that because of his futurist paradigm, he wasn't able to see that, okay, this is resurrection actually happening in real time, and it had nothing to do with bodies going into the ground and rising up out of dirt.
Well, what you and I get when we share this with people, because we have to pause here and say what people say at this point.
Mhm.
They're like, well, if you're saying that the resurrection had taken place in the first century, it was all fulfilled and so on, that doesn't leave anything for us today. What I try to answer that question with, because I think some people are asking it sincerely.
Hmm.
Some people think,
Yes, they are. They are.
some people just think, well, God's gone out of business. But the reality is that we enter into the benefits of what Christ did. We enter into the benefits of that resurrection. We experience resurrection life, at the point in time in which we enter into Christ,
Hmm.
and we have salvation and those things that go along with that. We enter into the benefits of the resurrection. All of those things are present for us. It's not a future fulfillment, but it's like the cross. The cross was an event in time in a certain place, but the benefits of the cross continue to apply.
Hmm.
And so you have to help people to say, look, this doesn't mean that God, has totally done away with everything and there's nothing for us today. We enter into what Christ has already done. It's a finished work.
I'd like to also parallel. That's a great point on looking at it from the standpoint of the power of the cross and seeing that connectivity between the two, the cross and the parousia, if you please. But another way that I like to look at it is the fulfillment of the second Exodus, which
Right.
we've talked about a lot on this program and in our studies, etc. Israel had the promise of coming out of Egypt
That's
for
right.
their deliverance, and as you know, in reading the Exodus narrative, they didn't believe that dropping them off somewhere, in the wilderness constituted their deliverance.
Right.
And God even told them, when you come into the land, X, Y, and Z. Okay. And so after that generation, those who survived and the new ones who came along entered into the land, they didn't have to physically, the generations that followed them, once they were in the land, um, they didn't have to go back through a whole nother Exodus in order to enjoy the benefits of that fulfilled promise.
That's right.
The Exodus was completed. They had entered the land and they were now enjoying the fruit of the land for everyone who came along thereafter. And that's the essence of the resurrection story from that perspective. It was the consummation of a journey, if you please, of coming out of that bondage from that old covenant system, from the powers of sin and death, into the salvation and the grace of God. And once that occurred, you don't have to go back through the 40 years again.
That's right.
Um, Even though there's a sense in which, in terms of, and I don't know what they would call it, I do know even in their participation of Passover, they relived the event as if they had gone through it. And that was a part of what observing the Passover was all about. But they didn't have to go back through that. And sometimes I think people miss that, as you were saying, in seeing the benefits of what that fulfillment was.
One of the empowering things of teaching a congregation these things is that you share with them, we are not the transition period church. We have the fullness of what they had in expectation. You remember in
Mm-hmm.
Hebrews 6, he said, you're tasting the powers of the age to come. They didn't have
Mm-hmm.
all of it,
Mm-hmm.
but they were beginning to experience the elements that went along with those things of what it meant to have it in its fullness. And so, people think, well, we got to go back and repeat everything that the first century believers did. No, that's not the point. You're missing the point when you think that. There are certain things that are part of the new covenant that continue in effect. I mean, God receives glory in the church throughout all ages, world without end, Ephesians 3:21. But, we're not waiting in expectation for those things those first century believers were just beginning to realize
Mm-hmm.
in their own lives and experience. So we're a victorious church when it comes to the things that pertain to the coming out from under the old covenant mode of existence into the new covenant. And what you said about flesh and spirit earlier, all throughout the letter of Romans, Paul uses flesh and spirit in contrasting those two covenants and what life was like under the old over against what life is like in the new. And once you begin to see those things, it totally transforms your way of thinking. It's exciting.
Yes, yes. You have a total different paradigm of how you view things. You can just imagine the difference in the experience of having to live through the wilderness where, and the people were out there crying, did you bring us out here to die and we have no food to eat and, we have no water to drink, et cetera. And so every turn they were murmuring and complaining because of the difficulties that they encountered along the way. But once they entered, those difficulties were gone. As you say, we're no longer in that transition. And so they were no longer in it. And when they entered into the promised land, it was a whole different thing. Now, it didn't take away all the challenges of life
No,
that they had to face. They still had to go through the normal challenges of life. They still had to do various things in order to appreciate and appropriate the things of that fulfilled time frame, but they didn't have to, repeat it from that particular perspective.
right now there are those who are pointing at us and saying, you know, give us some idea with the five physical senses what happened in the first century, and tell us how we're supposed to measure that to prove that it's true. And
Mm,
guys, you always want to spiritualize everything. See, they take the word spiritual as meaning unreal,
mm,
which of course that is just the opposite. I mean, the spiritual realm is more real than anything we can see with our eyes, or experience through the five physical senses. But just because you can't see it physically doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I mean, the Bible says in John 4:24, God is spirit. If God is spirit, does God exist? Absolutely.
exactly.
And so, we have to look at these things rationally, and saying that, I mean, God said that the seen things were temporal, the unseen things are eternal. I mean, I don't know how much more clearly God could have said that, but throughout the book of Hebrews, the emphasis is there on the contrast between the physical and the spiritual. Uh, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 46, there's a principle there. He says, first comes the natural and afterward the spiritual. When the people are studying the word today, and like the premillennial people, they wanted the first is the natural, and then the spiritual. Oh, and then God will go back to the natural again.
Yeah.
There's nothing in the scriptures that even lend support for that.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Um, when we, you were talking about this idea of, people just confusing that's realm of the spiritual and as if it's nothing. Uh, the Gospel of John, to me, is a fantastic book for seeing those contrasts. You mentioned it from Romans, where the apostles are basically applying that. But Jesus set the believers up for that throughout his ministry. For example, even talking about the kingdom before we even get to the Gospel of John, he said, the kingdom does not come with observation.
that's right.
And the kingdom of God is within you. Luke 17 and verse 20. You even have the text that talks about the hope in Colossians 1:27. He says, it's Christ in you, the hope of glory. I don't think that we could expect to have Christ in a physical sense inhabiting every single believer
No,
from that perspective. That has to be in a spiritual way, but that's what the Bible says is the hope. And there's only one hope in Scripture.
right.
And so when you look in, as far as an eschatological hope, when you look in Colossians 1:27, that's what it says. It's Christ in you, the hope of glory. And so to try to make that physical really would do, just violence to that text and to the concept. But in the Gospel of John, how many times did Jesus correct people about their understanding of these eschatological paradigms of which he spoke? He said, destroy this temple,
Right.
and in 3 days I will raise it up. Where did their minds go?
The,
Directly to the temple in Jerusalem. Well, 40
right.
and 6 years was this temple in building, and will you raise it up in 3 days? But they came to understand that he spoke of the temple of his body.
Right.
And, that's the spiritual body of Christ. Um, in ju-
Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood.
there you go.
It's not meant to be understood
Yeah.
literal.
Eh,
When Jesus told Nicodemus, "You must be born again." I had a sermon called Nick at Night. Anyway, Nicodemus said, "You mean I got to go back and get into my mother's womb and start all over again?" See, he didn't understand the contrast between the physical and the spiritual. That which is born of flesh is flesh. That which is born of spirit is spirit. There was a transformation that had to take place.
Yeah, and I guess, the guys who would object to this spiritual realm in which we now live, they would have to say, well, nobody's been born again because we're not in the spirit. We're still flesh. You can still, touch and feel and see it and everything. But that's not what Jesus was saying. In John 4, he talked about the living water.
That's
The
right.
one, and the woman at Samaria, she says, Lord, give me this water so that when I drink, I will never thirst again. She didn't get it. She didn't understand. She said, okay, we got Jacob's well here, but that's not where you draw living water from. Christ was saying he is the living water. And the same thing as you had alluded to earlier with resurrection and life. I am the resurrection. In John chapter 8, he told them, he's, in one statement leading into it, he said, before Abraham was, I am. Well,
Right.
they kind of took issue with that and they said, look, you're not even 50 years old. And have you seen Abraham? And so, he's telling them before Abraham was, I am. And then he says, if a man keep my word, you or he shall never see death. Well, they said, well, wait a minute. Abraham's dead. See, their minds went straight to the physical,
Yeah,
straight to the natural. Abraham is dead and the prophets. So why are you saying that a man will never see death? They had the wrong kind of death.
that's right. Well, I mean, Paul was speaking to a whole group, writing to a whole group of people living in the city of Ephesus. And he said, by the way, you've been raised to sit in the heavenly
Mm-hmm.
places in Christ. They hadn't left the city of Ephesus at all. And yet, spiritually speaking, they were seated with Christ in the heavenly places.
Correct.
And so Paul was bringing that to their attention that their location, spiritually speaking, had changed and they were experiencing what it is that God had for them in that regard.
You
It's a
mentioned
great message that we're sharing. People need to get a hold of this and let go of the physical things. It's about Israel and Hamas and all the stuff going on. No,
mm-hmm.
we're missing the point.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, you reminded me of the text in Colossians chapter 3, where Paul writes to them after having said what he did in chapter 2 when he showed how they died, buried with him in baptism, wherein they were also risen with him through faith in the operation of God. And then he comes back in chapter 3 and tells them, he says, for you died. Now he's writing to the church in Colossae, writing to people with all of their vital signs. And he said to them, for you died,
Okay.
and your life is hidden. Well, I don't think they were invisible,
Right.
as you say. They were people that he could communicate with, that he could see, that he could talk to, that he could interact with. You die, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. Well, what aspect of them was hidden?
Right.
It wasn't their physical life.
He told the Romans they weren't in the flesh.
Yeah.
What happened
Yes.
with that? They left their
Exactly.
physical bodies? No. It
So
Yeah.
when you carry that out in Colossians 3, he says, but when Christ, who is our life, appears, then you shall appear. Well, if what was there was hidden, and he said it was going to appear and you couldn't see what was hidden, why would you think you would see the other aspect of it
That's right.
with your natural eye? It just doesn't make sense. And the point that you're making from Romans 8, you are not in the flesh. Those who are in the flesh cannot what? They
Please
cannot please
God.
God. Yeah.
That's right. So there's so many aspects to this, and I think people are beginning to get a glimpse. You and I had an advantage that a lot of people today don't have. I mean, we were able to come together in those times back in the 80s and 90s, and everybody we were so hungry just to study and learn those things, and We had those around us that were sharing things with us, giving us material to read and so on. We had a good foundational
Hmm.
base.
Yes.
A lot of the people who come to fulfillment today, they don't have that foundational base, and they try to drag all kinds of other things with them into the view that don't fit. In
Hmm.
order to understand this, we have to step back from where we are spiritually in our understanding of the scriptures and take a fresh look at it. We have to keep in mind that our context in the 21st century is not the context of those to whom it was written or by those who were inspired of God to write it. And so, unless they step back, they're not going to see the beauty. You have to think like a first century Israelite to understand this stuff. They wouldn't have trouble understanding what Paul was talking about,
Correct.
but
You
people that
know, go
don't.
ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, one thing I was just sitting here thinking, we've been discussing this at least for the past 35 minutes or so.
Yep.
Um, and I don't recall one statement that we've made about time statements.
You
Have
mean you
you?
can talk about this stuff without discussing the time statements? How is that possible?
Uh, most definitely. If you look at the concepts, you can talk about it without even discussing the time statements. Now, they're there, they're important.
Sure.
I noted in the debate with Richard Carrier and Don Preston that that was one of the issues that he brought up as to why he felt like the Bible was false and that these things have no merit. He said, because they said they were going to do this at a certain time. And that's what all of these objectors
Yeah.
do, the major ones out there, whether it's the German rationalists, whether it's the Muslims, whether it's the Jews, etc. They all say, and as a matter of fact, this young man that I talked to a couple of days ago, he said, I think he was a dispensationalist to begin with. And he said, one passage always troubled me. He said it was Matthew 24, verse 34. All
Okay.
these things will happen in this generation. And
Yep.
I can't tell you how many times I've heard that over and over again from people who are not serious Bible students. They're serious Christians, but they're not serious students of prophecy, etc. And and they've always wondered about it. I always hear this statement, this generation, and that causes me to, you know, take a step back and think about it, but they don't know what to do with it a lot of times. It's just there. And then they hear, all of the future language, layered over the top of it. But he said that that's what really kind of stuck out with people talking about, or with that text in Matthew 24:34. And it's not just Matthew 24:34. There's a plethora of those passages there. And yes, they help to guide the understanding and interpretation. But as we've been demonstrating here, you don't have to get into those time statements necessarily
That's
to
right.
talk about these concepts and show the difference between the natural realm and the spiritual realm.
When I'm talking to people, one of the mistakes they often make is they think the Bible is about human history.
Mm,
It's not. It's about redemptive history.
exactly.
And once you're able to get that across to people, they begin to see the scope of what God was trying to reveal, from Genesis to the maps and how it applied and what was
Mm-hmm.
taking place. The first 39 books of the Bible were the time of promise and prophecy. The last 27 books of the Bible are about the time of realization and fulfillment.
Mm-hmm.
And once you look at it from that perspective, you can see the total picture of what God was doing and what a beautiful message it is. I sum up fulfillment in these words: we have it all in Jesus.
That's it. As even the text says, that God may be all in all.
Amen.
So, I don't think you can get any more um, um, complete, and there's not a better way to sum that up than to say that we have all, and that the fullness of Him is expressed in the fulfillment of all these things. And so it's just amazing. Well,
I,
look,
I,
Larry.
I want to say that it's been an honor to be here with you on the program this week. And if Don behaves, we'll let him back on here next
Yeah,
week.
we might
Yeah.
let him back.
But no, it's been a blessing. You and I haven't done anything together in years in terms of this kind of thing, and I have a great deal of love and respect for you and the family and the church out there, and I appreciate it. It's an honor to be here with you on the program today.
Well, same here, Larry. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and it's amazing just with that statement that you made that we haven't been together in a long time, and we come together and we talk about this like we've been together last week, or
That's
yesterday.
right.
And that's the beauty of it. And so you could see the harmony of it. You could see the consistency in terms of our being able to share these messages, be on the same page and same plane
Amen.
with them. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's the show for tonight. We certainly appreciate your being with us. We hope that we've shared some things that are edifying to you. I want to thank Larry for tuning in with us tonight and joining us in the absence of Don. I suppose he will be back on next week, but if not, then Larry, we can do it again, if that's okay with
Sounds
you.
good.
All right.
All right.
Well, with that, we're going to say good night, God bless, and we'll see you on next week.